He thought I was nothing. The voice would later echo in his mind. But tonight, under the warm glow of crystal chandeliers and the soft hum of a string quartet, Daniel Brooks didn't think about the past at all. He stood at the center of the ballroom like he owned the air itself, laughter rising easily from his chest as investors and executives leaned in, drawn to the gravity of his success. The scent of expensive cologne and aged whiskey lingering around him. And then, like a faint shadow at the edge of a spotlight, she appeared, Evelyn Carter, standing just beyond the golden circle of attention, dressed in a simple black gown that carried no label anyone could recognize, no diamonds, no statement, just quiet fabric that moved when she breathed. And for a moment, no one noticed her, which was exactly how it had always been. Invisible, replaceable, forgettable. Daniel followed a glance, then another, until his eyes landed on her. And something flickered, not guilt, not regret, just mild curiosity, the way one might look at an old photograph they no longer needed. He let out a small, amused breath, leaned toward the group beside him, and with a voice polished by years of control, he said, "That's my ex-wife." And the words drifted through the circle like perfume, subtle but intentional. A few heads turned, a few polite smiles formed, curiosity sharpened into quiet judgment. "She never really understood how this world works," he added, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. And a ripple of soft laughter followed, not cruel enough to be called out, but sharp enough to land. Evelyn heard it, every syllable, each one settling into the stillness inside her. But she didn't flinch. Her fingers rested lightly against the stem of her champagne glass, cool and steady, her breathing even, her gaze calm, as if the room was simply another place she had already outgrown. The music swelled gently in the background, violins threading through conversation, waiters gliding across marble floors with silver trays, and still, she didn't move, didn't leave, didn't react. Daniel watched her for a second longer than necessary, expecting something, a shift, a crack, a sign that she still existed in the version of the story he had written for her. But there was nothing, just that same quiet presence, unchanged and yet somehow untouchable. He looked away first, dismissing it, returning to the warmth of attention, to the easy rhythm of admiration, unaware that across the room, beyond the layers of wealth and performance, something had already begun to shift. Because Evelyn Carter was no longer standing there as the woman he had erased, and though no one in that room realized it. Yet, not even him, the balance of power had already tilted, silently, irreversibly, and she was waiting. The laughter faded behind her, but its echo lingered like a memory she had already survived. And as Evelyn stood beneath the soft amber glow of the chandeliers, the weight of that old life brushed against her again, not as pain, but as something distant, something smaller than it once was, because there had been a time when his voice could unravel her, when a single word from Daniel Brooks could make her question her worth, her choices, her very presence in a room like this. She remembered the quiet dinners where she spoke less and less, the way he would correct her in front of others with a polite smile that masked the precision of each cut, the nights she stood in front of a mirror in their glass-walled apartment, adjusting herself into someone more acceptable, more convenient, more invisible. He had called it refinement, growth, evolution, but in truth, it had been erosion, slow and deliberate, until there was almost nothing left of the woman she used to be. And when the divorce came, it was clean, efficient, like closing a deal, signatures on paper, a settlement that looked generous from the outside but carried none of the value she had once given. And just like that, she was written out of the narrative he had built, erased from the version of success he presented to the world. But what Daniel never noticed, what he never needed to notice, was what she had taken with her when she left. Because while he was busy building something visible, something loud, something admired, Evelyn had been learning quietly, observing, understanding the structure beneath the surface. The way power moved without being seen. The way influence did not need to announce itself to exist. And in the months that followed, when the silence around her felt unbearable, when the absence of noise forced her to hear her own thoughts again, she began to rebuild, not in the way he would recognize, not with grand gestures or public declarations, but in small, deliberate steps, late nights spent studying contracts, Early mornings understanding numbers she had once been told were not her concern, meetings no one knew she attended, decisions no one saw her make. And somewhere along the way, the woman he had dismissed as nothing became someone who no longer needed to be seen to have power. Back in the ballroom, the music shifted, softer now, almost anticipatory, and across the room, a man stood near the edge of the crowd, watching, not with curiosity, not with judgment, but with recognition. Sebastian Hale. Though no one said his name out loud in that moment, his presence carried its own gravity, quiet, controlled, the kind of influence that did not need introduction. His gaze rested on Evelyn for a fraction longer than coincidence allowed, and she felt it, not as pressure, but as confirmation, like a door already opened. Daniel continued speaking, unaware, his voice rising again as he entertained the circle around him. But the room was changing in ways he could not yet perceive. The conversations subtly shifting, the energy pulling in a direction he did not control. And Evelyn, still standing where she had always been, did not move, because she did not need to. Not anymore. She had already stepped into a different version of the room, one where visibility was no longer power, and for the first time, the space around her did not feel like something she had to earn. It felt like something that already belonged to her. And somewhere between the fading laughter and the rising silence, the past finally lost its hold, leaving only what was about to be revealed. The shift was almost imperceptible at first, a subtle tightening in the air as the host stepped onto the stage, his voice cutting cleanly through the low hum of conversation, polished and deliberate. Ladies and gentlemen, if I may have your attention. The music softened, glasses stilled midair, and one by one, the room turned toward the front. Daniel barely paused, finishing his sentence with a confident smile, assuming, as always, that whatever came next would orbit around him. But then the words landed, clear and precise. Tonight, we are honored to welcome the new controlling shareholder behind this company's most significant transition. A ripple moved through the crowd, curiosity sharpening into focus. Daniel's expression shifted, just slightly, because this was not information he had been given, not a move he had anticipated. And across the room, Sebastian Hale straightened, not stepping forward, not claiming attention, simply standing as if the moment did not belong to him at all. The host continued, a faint note of reverence threading into his tone. A visionary whose influence has already reshaped the foundation of this organization. And now the room was fully silent. Expectation pulling every gaze toward the obvious figure, toward Sebastian, because power like his did not need explanation. But instead of moving, he turned, just a fraction, his attention aligning with someone else. And for a heartbeat, no one understood, until the direction of his gaze became undeniable, until the room followed it, slowly, collectively, like a tide shifting, and there she was, still exactly where she had been. Evelyn Carter, unchanged in posture, unchanged in expression, and yet, suddenly, the center of everything, the host's voice came again, steady, final, Evelyn Carter, and the name did not echo, it settled, heavy and absolute. Daniel felt it before he understood it, a quiet fracture in the certainty he had built around himself, his hand tightening slightly around his glass, his mind searching for logic, for explanation, for any version of reality where this made sense. But there was none, because the woman he had dismissed, the one he had reduced to a footnote in his own story, was now standing at the point where every line converged. Evelyn moved then, not quickly, not dramatically, just one step forward, then another, the soft sound of her heels against marble, carrying farther than it should have, each movement deliberate, unhurried, as if time itself had adjusted to match her pace. Sebastian inclined his head, not as a gesture of control, but of acknowledgement, and when she reached the stage, the distance between who she had been and who she was now disappeared completely. Daniel's voice, when it came, was barely more than a breath. How? But the question did not reach her, not really, because she was no longer standing in a place where his understanding mattered. She turned her gaze toward him for the first time, calm, clear, untouched by the past he still clung to, and in that silence, the entire room seemed to lean into the space between them, waiting for something, a reaction, a confrontation, a moment of explanation. but she offered none, because she did not need to rewrite the past to redefine the present, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, quiet, yet it carried farther than anything else that night. "You taught me to be nothing," she said, not with anger, not with bitterness, just truth, and then, a pause, just long enough for the weight of it to settle. "So I became everything you could not see." And that was all. No triumph, no performance, just a statement that closed a chapter he did not even realize had ended. And as the room remained suspended in that silence, one thing became undeniable. She had not come back to prove anything. She had come back because she no longer needed to. The silence did not break. It settled, heavy and deliberate, like something the room did not dare disturb. And for a moment no one moved, no one spoke, because what had just unfolded could not be undone or reinterpreted. It simply existed, undeniable. Daniel stood where he was, the glass still in his hand though he no longer seemed aware of it. His reflection faintly distorted in the amber liquid, as if even that could not hold a steady version of him anymore. Around him, the same people who had laughed moments ago shifted subtly, their posture changing, their attention recalibrating. Conversations that once leaned toward him now angled elsewhere, toward the stage, toward her, toward the quiet center of gravity that had just rewritten the hierarchy of the room. Evelyn did not look back again. She did not need to confirm what had already been made clear. Instead, she turned slightly, her gaze moving across the audience not with triumph, but with a composed acknowledgement, as if she had always belonged here and the room was only just catching up. The host stepped aside instinctively, offering her space without needing to be told. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the calm authority of someone who no longer needed permission. She spoke not in grand declarations, but in measured clarity, outlining vision, direction, the future of the company in terms so precise and grounded that it left no room for doubt. This was not a performance. It was ownership, real and absolute. Each word she spoke quietly dismantled the illusion Daniel had built, not by attacking it, but by replacing it entirely across the room. Sebastian remained where he was, his expression unchanged, yet there was something in the stillness of his posture that spoke of alignment, not dominance, not control, but respect. As if the outcome had never been in question, Daniel finally lowered his glass, though his hand did not quite steady. His mind racing through fragments of memory he had long dismissed, moments he had overlooked, conversations he had not listened to, pieces of a larger picture he had never bothered to see. And now they rearranged themselves too late, forming something he could not ignore. He took a step forward, then stopped, because there was nowhere left to go that would return him to the position he once held. The distance between them was no longer physical, it was absolute, built not by walls, but by truth. And for the first time, the confidence that had defined him faltered, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that he felt it, a quiet realization settling in where certainty used to be. Evelyn finished speaking, not with a flourish, not with applause, but with a simple pause, as if she had said exactly what needed to be said and nothing more. And in that moment, the room responded, not with noise, but with attention, a collective understanding that something fundamental had shifted. She stepped back slightly, allowing the space to breathe again. But the energy did not return to what it had been. It could not, because the center had changed, and as the evening resumed around her, conversations restarting in softer tones, glances still drawn in her direction, one truth remained. She had not risen to power in that room. She had revealed that she had always held it, and the only thing that had changed was who finally realized it. The room moved again, but it no longer moved around him. Daniel felt it in the subtle shift of shoulders turning away, in the way conversations resumed without seeking his approval, in the quiet absence of the attention he once commanded without effort. And for the first time in years, he stood inside a space that did not recognize him as its center. The realization did not come as a shock, but as something slower, heavier, like a truth that had been waiting for him to notice. Across the ballroom, Evelyn stepped down from the stage, not to reclaim the spotlight, but to release it. Her presence no longer needed to prove anything. People approached her now, not out of curiosity, but with intention, their voices measured, their expressions attentive. each interaction reflecting a respect that could not be performed, only earned. She listened more than she spoke, her replies calm, precise, never reaching, never needing to fill the silence, because the silence itself had begun to work in her favor. Sebastian joined her only briefly, a quiet exchange that carried no display, no announcement, just a mutual understanding that did not require explanation. And when he stepped away again, it was clear he had never been the center of this moment, only a witness to it. Daniel watched from a distance he did not remember choosing, his thoughts circling back, searching for the version of her he once knew, the woman who would have looked at him for reassurance, who would have measured herself against his approval. But that version no longer existed, or perhaps it never truly had. Perhaps it had only been a reflection he projected onto her, something easier to control, easier to dismiss. And now, standing here, he saw what had always been beyond his view. Not because it was hidden, but because he had never cared to see it. He took a step forward, then another, the movement uncertain, not out of fear, but out of unfamiliarity, as if approaching her now required a different language, one he had never learned. When he finally reached her, she turned slightly, acknowledging him with the same composed expression she offered everyone else. No hesitation, no tension, just presence. And in that moment, he understood something he had not been prepared to face. He was no longer part of her narrative, not as an obstacle, not as a memory she needed to resolve, simply not part of it at all. Evelyn, he said, her name unfamiliar in his own voice, stripped of the certainty it once carried. She met his gaze, steady, unguarded, and for a brief second, there was a space where something could have been said, an apology, an explanation, a question, but none of it came, because none of it would have changed what had already been decided. She gave a small nod, not dismissive, not inviting, just complete, and then her attention shifted, not away from him in rejection, but toward what was already waiting for her, the conversations, the future, the movement of a life that no longer paused at his presence. Daniel remained where he was, the noise of the room returning around him, yet feeling distant, as if he were standing slightly outside of it now. And in that quiet separation, the truth settled fully. She had not come back for him. She had not come back to prove anything to anyone. She had come back because she had built something that no longer required acknowledgement. And as the evening continued without needing to revolve around a single voice, one thing became undeniable. Power had never left the room. It had simply changed hands long before anyone realized it. And now, it belonged entirely to her. The night continued. But for Evelyn, time seemed to slow into something more deliberate, more precise, as if every second now belonged fully to her, no longer dictated by someone else's expectations or approval. She moved through the room with a quiet ease that did not demand attention, yet naturally drew it. Conversations shifted when she approached, voices softened, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, and with each interaction, she felt the distance between who she had been and who she was now stretched further, until it no longer felt like distance at all, but transformation, complete and irreversible. A server passed by offering a tray of champagne, the delicate clink of glasses echoing softly as she selected one, the cool stem grounding in her fingers, familiar, steady, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to observe, not the room as it had once overwhelmed her, but the subtle patterns within it, the alliances forming in quiet corners, the measured glances between executives calculating their next move, the unspoken language of power that no longer felt foreign, because she understood it now, not as something to chase, but as something to navigate. Daniel remained in her peripheral awareness, not because she focused on him, but because his presence had become quieter, diminished in a way that did not require her attention. She could sense it in the way he lingered near the edges of conversations, in the slight hesitation before others responded to him, a shift so subtle that only someone who had once stood exactly where he stood could fully recognize it. And she did, not with satisfaction, not with bitterness, but with clarity. This was not something she had done to him. This was simply what happened when perception changed, when truth replaced assumption. Sebastian reappeared beside her, not interrupting, not imposing, just aligning with her presence as naturally as if they had always stood in the same space. You handled that exactly as expected, he said quietly, his voice carrying no surprise, only confirmation. Evelyn allowed a faint smile, not of pride, but of acknowledgement. It was never about handling it, she replied, her tone even. It was about not needing to. Sebastian studied her for a moment, then inclined his head slightly, a gesture that held more respect than any applause could offer, before stepping away once more, leaving her exactly where she needed to be. The music shifted again, a slower tempo now, the kind that softened the edges of the evening, and as the crowd adjusted, the energy settled into something calmer, more intentional. Evelyn walked toward the far side of the ballroom where the tall windows revealed the city lights stretching endlessly beyond, reflections shimmering against the glass. She paused there, not to escape, but to stand within a space that belonged entirely to her. The hum of the room behind her no longer pressing, no longer demanding, just existing, like everything else she had learned to let be. She lifted her gaze slightly, the skyline vast and steady, a quiet reminder of how much larger the world had always been beyond the confines she once accepted. And in that stillness, she realized something that felt both simple and profound. She had not reclaimed anything tonight. She had not taken back what was lost, because what she had now was not a return. It was something entirely new, something she had built without needing anyone to witness it. And as she turned back toward the room, toward the conversations waiting, toward the future already unfolding, there was no hesitation in her step, no lingering question, only certainty, because the woman who once stood quietly at the edge of someone else's story was gone, and in her place stood someone who no longer needed a story to define her. She was the author now, and the room, finally, had learned how to read her. There was a moment, subtle and nearly invisible, when the night stopped feeling like an event and started feeling like a transition, not for the room, but for him. Daniel stood near one of the marble columns now, no longer surrounded, no longer directing the flow of attention. And for the first time in years, he had nothing to say that anyone was waiting to hear. He watched Evelyn from a distance that felt unfamiliar, not because of the space between them, but because of everything that space now represented. She moved with a certainty he did not recognize, not the rehearsed confidence he once admired in others, but something quieter, something that did not need validation to exist. And as he observed her, fragments of the past surfaced again, not as nostalgia, but as missed details, moments he had dismissed without thought. The way she used to pause before speaking, not out of hesitation, but because she was choosing her words carefully. The way she listened fully, even when others spoke over her. The way she noticed things he never bothered to see. He had mistaken all of it for weakness, for lack of ambition, because it did not mirror his own. And now, standing here, he realized that what he had overlooked had not disappeared. It had evolved, refined itself into something far more powerful than anything he had built through force or visibility. Across the room, Evelyn paused near a small group of investors, her posture relaxed, her voice low but steady as she responded to a question. She did not speak to impress. She spoke to be understood, and the effect was immediate. The group leaned in, their attention undivided, their expressions shifting from polite interest to genuine respect. Daniel felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Not regret, not yet, but the beginning of it. The recognition that he had not lost her in the way he once believed. He had simply never known her at all. The realization did not arrive with drama. It settled slowly, like a quiet truth that had nowhere else to go. He took a step forward again, this time not stopping, moving through the room with a different kind of awareness, noticing how the energy no longer parted for him, how he had to navigate it instead of command it. And when he reached her once more, there was no audience, no stage, just the two of them standing within the same space for the first time in years. "I did not see it," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of its usual certainty. Evelyn turned to him, her expression unchanged, but there was a stillness in her gaze that held his attention more firmly than any reaction could have. "No," she replied simply, not unkind, not forgiving, just true, and that was all. No accusation, no elaboration, because she did not need to explain what he had failed to understand. Daniel let out a quiet breath, the weight of that single acknowledgement heavier than anything she could have said, and for a moment, neither of them moved. the noise of the room continuing around them, yet somehow distant, as if this small space existed outside of it. He searched her face for something familiar, something he could hold on to. But there was nothing there that belonged to the past he remembered, only the present, steady and complete. And in that moment, he understood that whatever he had lost was not something he could recover, not because she had taken it away, but because he had never recognized its value when it was his to hold. Evelyn gave a slight nod, not as closure, not as invitation, simply as acknowledgement of what had been said, and then she turned, stepping back into the rhythm of the evening, leaving him standing in a place that no longer required his presence. And as he watched her go, one thought remained, clear and undeniable. She had not become someone new. She had become someone he had never been capable of seeing, and now, it was too late to look again. The night did not end with a single moment. It unfolded, slowly, like something that had already been decided long before anyone stepped into that room. And as the hours moved forward, the rhythm of the evening softened into something quieter, more revealing. Evelyn no longer stood at the center, yet the center seemed to follow her without effort. Conversations continued to orbit around her presence, not because she demanded it, but because she no longer resisted it. She had stopped shrinking, stopped adjusting herself to fit the expectations of others, and that absence of effort had become its own kind of gravity. Across the ballroom, Daniel remained where the edges met the light, watching not with the detached confidence he once carried, but with a stillness that felt unfamiliar. He was not excluded, not rejected, but no longer necessary, and that distinction settled deeper than any humiliation could have. He had spent years believing that presence was control, that visibility was power, but now he stood in a room where the most powerful person did not need to announce herself at all. Evelyn moved toward a quieter corner where a small group of executives spoke in measured tones, their conversation shifting as she approached, not out of politeness, but because her input now carried weight that could not be ignored. She listened, asked a single question, and in that question, reframed the entire direction of their discussion, not by dominating it, but by seeing what others had overlooked. The effect was immediate, subtle nods, a pause, a recalibration, and Daniel saw it clearly. The same qualities he once dismissed were now the very reason she commanded respect. Not louder, not sharper, just clearer, and for the first time, he understood that what he had called nothing had never been absence. It had been depth, depth he had never taken the time to understand. Sebastian crossed the room again, stopping beside Evelyn not as a superior, not as a guide, but as someone who recognized an equal. Their exchange brief, almost understated, yet it carried the kind of alignment that could not be manufactured, only earned. Daniel noticed the absence of spectacle in their interaction. No display of alliance, no need to prove connection, because the reality of it was already evident to anyone paying attention, and that realization settled into him with quiet finality. Whatever role he once believed he played in her life no longer existed, not even as a contrast. She was not defined by what she had left behind. She was defined by what she had built in its absence. The music shifted once more, softer now, signaling the close of the evening. Guests began to gather their coats, conversations winding down into quieter farewells, but the energy did not return to its original state. It could not. Something fundamental had changed, and everyone in the room felt it, even if they could not fully name it. Evelyn made her way toward the exit, not in a hurry, not lingering, simply moving forward. As she reached the threshold, the city lights beyond the glass doors stretched wide and open, reflecting against the polished floors behind her. She paused for a fraction of a second, not to look back, but to stand fully within that moment, complete and self-contained. Daniel watched her from where he stood, the distance between them no longer measured in steps, but in understanding. And as she stepped out into the night, the door closing quietly behind her, one truth remained, clear and undeniable. She had not returned to reclaim anything. She had returned to reveal what had already been hers all along. And now, for the first time, there was nothing left in that room that could hold her back. The night air was cooler than she expected, carrying the faint scent of rain against warm pavement. And as Evelyn stepped onto the polished stone outside the venue, the noise of the ballroom faded into something distant, almost unreal. like a chapter that had already closed before she walked through the door. The city stretched out in front of her, endless lights flickering across glass towers and quiet streets, each one a reminder that the world had always been larger than the confines she once accepted. She paused for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, the kind that comes when something shifts so completely that it leaves no trace of what came before. Behind her, through the tall glass doors, the room continued without her, voices rising and falling, music soft and controlled, but none of it reached her now, not in the way it once would have, because she no longer stood inside a space that defined her. She stood outside of it, free of its weight. Across the entrance, a black car waited with quiet precision, its presence understated yet intentional. The driver stepped forward as she approached, opening the door without a word, as if everything had already been arranged long before she arrived. And perhaps it had, not by coincidence, but by design, the kind she had learned to create for herself. As she moved closer, she caught her reflection briefly in the dark surface of the car. The same woman, the same features, and yet entirely different, not because of what she wore, but because of what she no longer carried. No doubt, no need for approval, no invisible weight pressing her into silence, just presence, steady and complete. Back inside, Daniel remained near the edge of the room, though the space around him felt emptier than before, conversations continuing without pause, the night closing in a rhythm that no longer required his participation. He glanced once toward the doors, as if expecting something. A return, a final look, but none came, because there was nothing left unfinished, nothing left to say. What had needed to be understood had already been made clear without explanation, and for the first time, he recognized the absence not as loss, but as consequence. Quiet, undeniable. Outside, Evelyn stepped into the car, the soft leather seat grounding beneath her, the door closing with a muted finality that separated her completely from the world she had just left behind. The city lights blurred slightly as the vehicle began to move, not fast, not rushed, just forward. And as she looked out through the window, watching reflections stretch and dissolve across the glass, a single thought settled into place, clear and unwavering. She had not returned to reclaim her place in that room. She had outgrown it entirely, and whatever came next would not be built on what she had escaped, but on what she had become. The car turned onto a quieter street, the noise fading further, the night opening ahead of her, and somewhere between where she had been and where she was going, the past finally lost its shape, leaving nothing behind but the certainty that she was no longer defined by it. She was moving beyond it, into something no one else had the power to take away. The city moved past her in quiet streaks of light, reflections sliding across the glass like fragments of a life she no longer needed to revisit. And inside the car, Evelyn sat still, not in silence, but in clarity, the kind that comes when every question that once kept you awake has already been answered without needing words. Her hands rested loosely in her lap, no tension, no lingering trace of the woman who once measured her worth through someone else's gaze, because that version of her had not survived the journey. It had dissolved somewhere between loss and understanding, leaving behind something far more precise, something that did not need validation to exist. The driver adjusted slightly as the car turned onto a wider avenue, the hum of tires against pavement steady, grounding, and for a moment, Evelyn closed her eyes, not to escape, but to feel the stillness fully, to recognize it as something she had earned, not given, not borrowed, but built, piece by piece, decision by decision, far from the noise of rooms that once defined her. Back at the venue, the lights had begun to dim, signaling the end of the evening, guests dispersing in quiet clusters, their voices lower now, reflective, carrying fragments of what had just taken place. Daniel stood near the exit, though he had not yet stepped outside, his reflection faint in the glass doors, overlapping with the city beyond, as if he were caught between two versions of reality, one he had believed in, and one that had just replaced it. He replayed the night in fragments, not the laughter, not the conversations, but the moments he had missed, the pauses he had ignored, the presence he had failed to recognize. And in that quiet review, something settled deeper than regret, something closer to understanding, the kind that does not arrive in time to change anything, but stays long enough to reshape everything that comes after. He reached for the door, then stopped, his hand resting against the cool metal handle. Because stepping outside would not bring her back, would not return him to a version of the story where he still mattered. It would only confirm what he already knew, that whatever had once connected them no longer existed in a form he could reach. And so he let his hand fall, remaining where he was, not out of indecision, but because there was nothing left to decide. Inside the car, Evelyn opened her eyes again. The city now stretching wider, quieter, the buildings less crowded, the noise fading into something distant and manageable. And in that space, she allowed herself a single thought, not about him, not about the room, but about what came next, not as a question, but as a direction, because for the first time in a long time, the future did not feel like something uncertain. It felt like something already unfolding, shaped by her choices, her understanding, her refusal to remain unseen. The car slowed. As it approached a private building, its exterior understated, elegant without excess, the kind of place that did not announce its value, but held it quietly. The driver stepped out, opening her door, and as she stepped onto the pavement, the night air greeted her again. Cooler now, steadier. She looked up briefly, the skyline still stretching endlessly above, unchanged and yet entirely different from how she had once seen it. And as she moved toward the entrance, one truth remained, clear and unshakable. She had not become powerful because someone had given her a place in the room. She had become powerful because she no longer needed one. And whatever doors opened for her now would not define her. They would simply follow her lead. The lobby was quiet in a way the ballroom could never be. The kind of quiet that did not compete for attention. It simply existed, polished marble floors reflecting soft overhead lighting, the faint scent of clean linen and cedar lingering in the air. And as Evelyn stepped inside, her heels echoed gently, each step measured, unhurried, belonging fully to her. The doorman offered a respectful nod, not recognition of status, but acknowledgement of presence, and she returned it with the same calm composure that had carried her through the night. The elevator doors opened without delay, smooth and silent, and as she stepped inside, the city fell away behind her, replaced by the contained stillness of a space that moved upward without resistance. She watched her reflection in the mirrored panel, not searching, not evaluating, simply seeing, and for the first time in a long time, there was nothing in that reflection she wanted to change, no adjustment to make, no version of herself to refine for someone else's comfort, just clarity, steady and complete. The doors opened onto a private floor, the transition seamless, as if the building itself understood that there was no need for interruption. Inside, the apartment welcomed her with the same quiet elegance, floor-to-ceiling windows revealing the city stretched out below like a living map, lights flickering in patterns that felt distant yet familiar. She set her glass down on the marble counter, the soft sound grounding, real, and moved toward the window, her reflection merging briefly with the skyline before dissolving into it. And in that moment, she allowed herself to feel what she had not felt inside the ballroom, not because she could not, but because she had chosen not to, a quiet release, not of tension, but of the last remaining weight she had carried without realizing it. The need to be understood by someone who had never tried to see her. Back at the venue, Daniel finally stepped outside, the night air sharper now, cooler against his skin, the absence of the crowd amplifying the quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar. He looked down the street, though there was nothing left to look for. The car's already gone, the doors already closed, and for a brief moment, he stood there without movement, as if waiting for something that would not return. The realization did not come with urgency. It settled slowly. The understanding that some moments do not offer a second version. They simply pass, leaving behind only what they were meant to reveal. Inside her apartment, Evelyn exhaled softly, the kind of breath that does not come from relief, but from completion. She reached for her phone, not to revisit the night, not to check who had noticed, but to move forward, messages already waiting, opportunities already unfolding, decisions that would shape what came next. And as she scrolled briefly, then set it aside, one thought remained clear. She had spent too much time being defined by what others failed to recognize, and now, there was no one left who held that power. The city beyond the glass continued its quiet motion, unchanged, yet entirely different in the way. She now saw it, and as she turned away from the window, moving deeper into the space that belonged fully to her, there was no hesitation, no lingering question, only direction, because whatever came next would not be a response to the past. It would be an extension of everything she had already become, and this time, there would be no one left to underestimate her, not even herself. Morning arrived without announcement, a quiet shift in light that filtered through the glass and settled gently across the marble floors, and Evelyn stood near the window, already awake, already present, not pulled from sleep by urgency, but guided into the day by intention, the city below moving at its own pace. Traffic threading through intersections, people stepping into routines that felt distant from the stillness she occupied. She held a cup of coffee in her hands, the warmth steady, grounding, a small detail in a life that no longer depended on chaos to feel meaningful. Her reflection lingered faintly in the glass, layered over the skyline, and for a moment, she observed it again, not searching for flaws, not measuring worth, simply recognizing the same features, the same quiet composure, but now accompanied by something that had taken time to build, something that could not be taken away because it had never been given. Her phone rested on the counter behind her, notifications already waiting, messages from executives, updates from teams, invitations to conversations that would shape the next phase of what she had already begun, and yet, she did not rush toward it, because she no longer needed to prove responsiveness, no longer needed to demonstrate urgency to validate her place. She turned from the window slowly, setting the cup down with deliberate care, the soft sound marking a transition not just into the day, but into the continuity of everything she had built. Back across the city, Daniel sat alone in an office that once felt like a command center, the early light harsher here, less forgiving, reflecting off glass surfaces that now felt more exposed than polished. He had arrived earlier than usual, not out of discipline, but because sleep had not come easily, the night replaying in fragments that refused to settle, not loud, not overwhelming, just persistent. He stared at the documents spread across his desk, numbers, projections, details he once controlled with precision, and yet, something in them now felt different, not incorrect, but incomplete, as if he were looking at a version of reality that no longer held the full picture. His phone buzzed briefly, a notification he did not immediately check, because for the first time, information no longer gave him certainty. It only reminded him of how much he had overlooked. He leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting toward the window, the same city stretching out before him, but not in the same way, because he now understood that perspective had never been about position. It had been about awareness, and it had come too late to change what had already unfolded. Inside her apartment, Evelyn moved toward her desk, the space organized not for appearance, but for clarity, each detail intentional, each decision reflecting the structure she had built without needing anyone to see it in progress. She picked up her phone, scanning the messages briefly, her responses measured, concise, never excessive. Because she no longer needed to fill space to be heard, every word carried weight simply because it was chosen, not forced. And as she set the phone back down, one realization settled fully into place. The night before had not been a peak, not a singular moment to be remembered. It had been a reveal, a quiet unveiling of something that had existed long before anyone noticed. And now, there was no return from it. No version of her that would step back into smaller spaces to make others comfortable. She walked back toward the window once more, the city now fully awake, movement steady, purposeful. And in that view, she saw not opportunity, not challenge, but alignment, because everything she had worked toward was no longer ahead of her. It was already in motion, and as the day unfolded, one truth remained constant. She had not become powerful overnight. She had simply stopped allowing anyone else to define what that power looked like. And now, there was nothing left to take from her, only everything left to build. By the time the sun reached its highest point, the city had settled into its usual rhythm, unaware that anything had changed, unaware that somewhere above the streets, behind glass and quiet decisions, a different kind of power had already taken hold. Evelyn stood once more at the edge of her office space, not overlooking the skyline now, but immersed within it, the soft hum of activity surrounding her, voices measured, footsteps purposeful, every movement aligned with something larger than individual ambition, and yet none of it overwhelmed her, because she was no longer reacting to the world around her, she was shaping the pace of it. Her team moved with clarity, not because she demanded it, but because her presence made uncertainty unnecessary, instructions given without excess, direction offered without pressure, and in that environment, everything seemed to settle into place naturally. Across the city, Daniel sat in a meeting that felt strangely distant, voices speaking, slides changing, strategies discussed, but none of it carried the same weight it once had, not because it lacked importance, but because his understanding of importance had shifted. He found himself pausing more, listening in a way he never had before, noticing gaps where he once saw certainty, recognizing patterns he had previously ignored, and in those quiet observations, he began to see what he had missed, not just in her, but in everything, the cost of overlooking depth in favor of control. Back in her office, Evelyn walked through a series of decisions that would influence the direction of the company for years to come. Not rushed, not dramatic, each choice deliberate, grounded in something deeper than immediate gain. Because she no longer built for validation, she built for sustainability, for clarity, for something that would remain even when attention moved elsewhere. Sebastian entered briefly, offering a single update, their exchange efficient, aligned, and then he was gone again, leaving no trace of hierarchy, only collaboration. And as Evelyn returned to her desk, she paused for a moment, not out of doubt, but out of awareness, the kind that comes when you recognize that the life you once fought to be seen in has been replaced by one where visibility is no longer the goal. She looked around, not at the space itself, but at what it represented, the result of choices made in silence, of growth that no one applauded, of strength that was never announced. And in that stillness, one final truth settled fully into place. She had not become the most powerful woman in the room by entering it. She had become it long before anyone noticed. The room had simply caught up, and somewhere, far from where she stood now, Daniel looked out at the same skyline, understanding at last that power had never been